Hello, my name is Alyssa, and this is video 2 for week 1 of Write Nights, where we're talking about academic phrases. In the first video, we talked about how the phrases and vocabulary that academic writers use really vary from discipline to discipline, but there are a few key characteristics that are consistent across the board. All academic writing tends to be concise, it incorporates a mix of hedges and boosters, and it uses language such as modifiers to show a narrow scope. We're going to edit this paragraph together to improve its use of academic language. So this is adapted from the abstract of Dale et al.'s 2020 article called Meeting the Climate Change Challenge, Local Government Climate Action in British Columbia, Canada, from the academic journal Climate Policy. And we're going to go sentence by sentence, and I'm going to show you how I would improve this paragraph so that it more effectively incorporates academic language. That first sentence is, local governments are important for climate change. And the first thing I notice is this word important. That is a vague, value-laden word that doesn't really tell me anything explicitly as the reader. What's important to me as the writer might not be what my reader thinks is important, or it might not paint that same mental picture. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to read that second sentence and see if I can find an answer in there to why local governments are important for climate change. That second sentence reads, they have jurisdiction over so much of greenhouse gas emissions so they can make climate innovations happen. When I read that second sentence, I find the answer to my question of why they are important right here at the end. They're important because they can make the innovations happen. They have this ability to make change. So in this case, I'm going to improve my academic writing by getting rid of that vague, value-laden term important that doesn't really tell me anything, especially for the first sentence of a paragraph. It's not really much of a hook. It doesn't lay out the topic for me. And instead, I'm going to combine these two sentences to produce something that more explicitly states what I want to say. So I'm going to change the sentence so that it reads, local governments are critical to the implementation of climate innovations because they have jurisdiction over so much of greenhouse gas emissions. I might even add in here, local governments are critical to the implementation of climate innovations related to climate change, and really narrow in on my topic with some modifiers. Now, I'm not quite happy with this sentence yet. The reason being, I have this term, this phrase, so much here describing the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that local governments have jurisdiction over. That boosting term is pretty vague and it's not actually very helpful. When I read that, I don't get a good sense of the extent to which local governments truly have jurisdiction, and that kind of exaggerated claim actually I think weakens this first sentence because it seems to be overemphasizing without actually providing any real detail. So to improve that, I might either get rid of it or be more specific with my term. I might replace it with an academic phrase that is clearer about the exact number. Perhaps I say something like the majority, or even more specific, 75% of greenhouse gas emissions, depending on what the research supports. So now, if I reread this sentence, it's going to present a much clearer, stronger idea right from the beginning. Local governments are critical to the implementation of climate innovations related to climate change because they have jurisdiction over the majority of greenhouse gas emissions. That sets the tone for my paragraph in a much clearer and more direct way because I've gotten rid of those vague, unclear modifiers and replaced them with more concrete terms. If we look at the second sentence, we can apply somewhat similar logic. The second sentence reads, there's an exciting new study called the Climate Change Challenge, which is the first longitudinal study to explore climate innovation in Canadian municipalities. So once again, I take note of this term exciting. What is exciting about this study? Do I find it exciting? Would my reader find it exciting? Why is it exciting? And to answer that question, I'm actually going to look at the second half of the sentence. So I see that it's the first study to do this. And that is what is exciting about it. So there's the answer to my question. So in order to improve this, once again, I'm going to get rid of that vague modifying word that doesn't really do anything explicitly for my argument. And instead, I'm going to restructure this sentence so that I'm being direct from the beginning. I'm going to get rid of this empty subject and verb as well. Academic writing sometimes will require you to use an opener like there is, or there are, or it is. But this is actually what we call an empty subject, where the there and the it are standing in for nothing in particular. When possible, it's often much stronger to jump right in to the thing you actually want to talk about. So I'm going to start my sentence with a new study called Meeting the Climate Change Challenge. I'm going to get rid of this relative pronoun that sets apart that information and jump right into my verb. So this now reads, a new study called Meeting the Climate Change Challenge is the first longitudinal study to explore climate innovations in Canadian municipalities. This is straightforward, direct, and tells my reader exactly what I want to tell them without any vague or unclear terms. Moving on to the next sentence, right now it reads, it talks about efforts to set and meet climate change goals by all the provinces in the federal government, but it talks most about British Columbia because their efforts were most ambitious. So the first thing that I notice about this sentence is the choice of verb talks about, and we actually use it twice here. Talks most about the second time around. Academic writing tends to be more formal. It's good to use vocabulary terms that are accessible and not overly complex or jargony, but you still want to be formal. So phrasal verbs, action words that are made up of a base verb and a preposition are often considered informal or not as appropriate for academic writing. So whenever you find yourself using phrasal verbs, it's a good opportunity to analyze your writing and say, is there a stronger verb? Is there a stronger action word that I could put here instead that will paint a clearer picture for my reader? So in this case, I want to talk about how the study Meeting the Climate Change Challenge looks at or discusses efforts to set and meet climate change goals. When I read that study, though, perhaps it doesn't just discuss these things, but maybe it does something more. Maybe it analyzes these efforts, or maybe it critiques these efforts, or evaluates these efforts. So you want to ask yourself, what is my subject actually doing? What's the action happening here? And choosing strong verbs is a great way to improve the strength of your academic language throughout your paper. So now this first part says, it analyzes efforts to set and meet climate change goals by all the provinces and the federal government. And then we have this but it talks most about British Columbia because their efforts were most ambitious. So that but word, that connecting word, is telling me as the reader that the ideas on either side are kind of equally important, are standalone. When I think about what I'm trying to say here, though, I think this is where I'm trying to narrow my scope. So I want to tell my reader that this study really focuses on British Columbia for particular reasons. And when we think about scope as engaging your reader in the world of research, this kind of narrowing in on a particular detail is a really good way to do that. So I'm going to improve this sentence here by better integrating, or by further integrating, the second part of my sentence about British Columbia into the first part of the sentence, like this. All right, so now the sentence reads, it analyzes efforts to set and meet climate change goals by all the provinces and the federal government, with a particular focus on British Columbia because their efforts were most ambitious. I might actually even change this to a relative pronoun, whose efforts were most ambitious. And you'll notice that when you're editing your writing, it's an iterative process. You might make one change to one part of your sentence and then have to go back and make another change. And then after you go through the whole paragraph, you read through and realize you need to make more changes. And that's okay. That's all part of the writing process. So I'm going to leave this for now. But when I read the sentence, maybe it still feels a little bit clunky. Maybe it's something that I think about coming back to later on in my editing process. I'm going to go on to the next sentence, the final sentence of this paragraph, which currently reads, this gives a synthesis of research outcomes and their implications for environmental governance at multiple scales and how policy innovations might be able to accelerate transformation toward carbon neutral economies. So the very first thing I notice in this sentence is the subject of my sentence is this. Academic writing tries to use concise language, and part of that is being specific and explicit in naming the things you're talking about. So just saying this is quite unclear. What is this referring to? Is it the Meeting the Climate Change Challenge study? Is it the efforts put forward by British Columbia? Either of those might seem like they might be correct on a quick read, but actually this is trying to refer to the article itself, the text that I, the author, am writing. So I'm going to clarify that by saying this article gives a synthesis of research. Remember, this is the introductory paragraph, or really the abstract to my overall paper. So this is the part where I'm telling my reader what I've written and why they should be interested in it. So now it says, this article gives a synthesis of research outcomes and their implications for environmental governance at multiple scales, and how policy innovations might be able to accelerate transformation towards carbon neutral economies. The other thing we can think about in terms of academic vocabulary, academic phrases, is the function of the words we're using. So lots of things are going on here. The sentence is quite long, and I want to bring your attention to how we have this and word connecting two things. And on either side of that and, we're detailing what the article gives a synthesis of. So one, research outcomes and their implications, and two, how policy innovations might be able to accelerate transformation. We like to have parallelism in our vocabulary, though, in academic writing. And so I don't have parallelism between these two things. On the one hand, I start with a noun, an actual concrete thing, research outcomes. And then after the and, I'm pairing it with a how phrase, how policy innovations. So when I think about what function do I want my words to be fulfilling in the second part of the sentence, a question word isn't the function I'm going for. I'm not asking a question. Now it's completely grammatical to use a question word like how in this way, but stylistically and structurally, and in terms of choosing effective vocabulary, is this the choice I want to make? I'm going to say no, and instead I'm going to replace this and restructure this a little bit so I have more parallelism, and I'm putting forward an academic phrase that better matches the one that comes on the other side of the and. All right, so now this final sentence read, this article gives a synthesis of research outcomes and their implications for environmental governance at multiple scales, and the potential for policy innovations to accelerate transformation toward carbon neutral economies. I've replaced that how with this potential for phrase so that I have that parallelism, thinking about what function of are my words supposed to be fulfilling here. So now if we reread this whole paragraph from top to bottom, hopefully you find it's a little bit more clear and that it better utilizes vocabulary and phrases that sound academic. Local governments are critical to the implementation of climate innovations related to climate change because they have jurisdiction over the majority of greenhouse gas emissions. A new study called Meeting the Climate Change Challenge is the first longitudinal study to explore climate innovation in Canadian municipalities. It analyzes efforts to set and meet climate change goals by all the provinces and the federal government, with a particular focus on British Columbia, whose efforts were most ambitious. This article gives a synthesis of research outcomes and their implications for environmental governance at multiple scales, and the potential for policy innovations to accelerate transformation toward carbon neutral economies. So that's our edited paragraph. If you're interested in seeing the original version, the citation is here. I hope that this has been helpful as you develop your academic writing skills and your academic vocabularies. Join us next week at Write Nights, where we're going to talk about articles and how to use those little words in your writing like a, an, and the.